In our study of our examples of faith, we've been moving through the Old Testament pretty quickly, so I think it's probably a good time to take a checkpoint and locate ourselves on the timeline of God's people. This time in their history is years after the reigns of David and Solomon. A number of years. There has been a sort of a free fall from those glory days, and there's been a vacuum in leadership. There's just been a gap there, and it's caused a spiritual crash. And as a result, there's this cycle that's been in place for a few years, that they'll have a good king for a while, then they'll have a bad king. Then they'll have a good king and bad king, and it's just kind of one of those repetitious things. And it's during the reign of a bad king, evil King Ahab, that Elijah bursts onto the scene. Now, in Ahab's day, idol worship was so prevalent that they were bowing down to everything around them. And not only was that happening, but Ahab's wife, Jezebel, had issued a command to hunt down and kill God's priests. It was a very dark day in the history of Israel, and it was a very difficult time for the people of God. Those who wanted to worship the true God were in the minority. And so in that setting, God lowers the boom on the whole nation. He sends Elijah. First of all, when he bursts on the scene, Elijah announces that there will be a drought for 3+ years. And there will be no rain unless it's at his word. Well, you can imagine that didn't win any points with King Ahab. He was sending out search party after search party to try to find Elijah, and he couldn't, because God hid him during those years until it was time for him to speak to the people again. And that's where we find ourselves in this story about Elijah. And he comes and speaks to the king first and then to the people. And when Elijah spoke, he spoke in the same manner with the same authority as Moses and Joshua. He challenged the people to choose who they were going to worship. You remember at the end of Joshua's life, he said to the people, "Now choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And well, that's the kind of authority and boldness that Elijah used when he spoke for the Lord. And he basically said to the people, you cannot waver if you have chosen the Lord's path. You must be steadfast and faithful to what God has laid out for you as his path for life. And there's no middle ground. Someone has said it this way: he's either Lord of all or not at all. And so how did the people respond when Elijah made this declaration? You need to turn to the Lord and be faithful to him. Do you remember? Yes, it was that response. Silence. They didn't say anything. Well, I was kind of giving you a sneak peek at this part of my sermon with the children's discovery time. They looked at the odds. They said, okay, there's Elijah on this side. And there's 450 of the men of the king's hired henchmen on this side. Maybe we ought to just take a wait and see attitude to see how this all turns out. Now, they may have been silent. They may have been silent when Elijah challenged them to be true to the Lord, but they shouted in response to Elijah's showdown on Mount Carmel. They shouted and said, "Yeah, let's go for it." Well, when I think of their silence, when Elijah challenged them to be true to the Lord, the people at that time have been so far removed from God's power and authority that they weren't sure what to believe or when to take a stand. A weak faith lacks strength for times like that. Now, Elijah, however, he puts his faith to the test right away in several different ways. The first way he does it is to let the worshipers and prophets of Baal go first in this contest. And after they do their best to call down fire from Baal, Elijah starts ridiculing them and taunting them and saying, "Where is your God? Is he off on vacation? Is he sleeping and you have to wake him up?" He even gives them extra time for their God to answer. And nothing happens. So then Elijah takes it to the next level, to another dimension, if you will. He takes over and he begins to prepare his sacrifice. And he makes everything in order, puts the bull on the altar, and then he does something that probably everybody went. He orders people to pour water on the sacrifice. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Now, you scientists know that water and fire don't mix too well. So we see how confident Elijah is in his God and how he will answer prayer. He says, "I'm going to even put so much that it's going to fill up that trench around the altar. And I'm going to prove that the Lord is God alone." Now, finally, after everything is prepared, Elijah issues a bold prayer. And he basically cries out to the Lord and says, "Answer me, O Lord, so that all will know that you alone are God, and that what I'm doing has been commanded by you, and when you answer this prayer, people will know that you're using this to draw them back to you." And God does send fire. Oh boy, does he send fire. There's no problem with water when God sends fire. God's fire burns up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones of the altar. It evaporates the water and scorches the ground. That's not throwing another shrimp on the barbie, folks, to take it from a very famous movie. That is making a statement about how God is the Lord of all. And do you know that after this contest was over, that's when the heavens opened and the rain came? Not only did God send down fire, he sent rain. He sent rain to help them understand that He was providing for them in the midst of a drought. So in two ways, God has answered Elijah's prayers. Now, after Elijah had this experience, he had a major battle with depression. I think there's a real evidence that when we have a spiritual mountaintop experience, and maybe some of you have had those, if you've had a spiritual mountaintop experience, that's when we're most vulnerable to the attacks of the enemy, because we're on top of things. We are riding high, and that's when the enemy likes to attack us. And that's what he did with Elijah. Because when Queen Jezebel heard that the prophets of Baal had been slaughtered after the contest on Mount Carmel, all 450 false prophets of Baal were slaughtered by the people. Jezebel decided that it was time for Elijah to get some of his own medicine. So she said, "Far be it from me if by tomorrow morning you're not just like those prophets of Baal." She was after him. And so he ran. He ran for his life. And he found a hiding place, and he just said, "Lord, I've had enough. I'm tired. I feel all alone and isolated. I just want to die." But God had other plans for Elijah. God had plans for him because he was to mentor the next prophet that would continue the counsel of God for the people of Israel, and his name was Elisha. Now, one little note about Elijah. Remember, he prayed to die. He was that depressed and discouraged. He never did taste death. He was one of only 2 people in the Bible who never experienced death. There was Elijah, and there was, Jesus experienced death. Most definitely. Yeah, Jesus experienced death. Who was the other? Enoch. Back in the Old Testament, way back there in the early part of Genesis, Enoch walked with God, and it says, and then he wasn't. He wasn't around anymore. God just swept him up. And so Elijah never experienced death because God strengthened his faith to press on even in the most difficult situations. In fact, Elijah's faith was a pattern for another New Testament person that sort of dressed like Elijah and spoke with God's authority. Does anybody remember who that New Testament person was? John the Baptist. John the Baptist was seen as the second Elijah. And John the Baptist prepared the way for the Savior, Jesus. So, not only that, but Elijah shows up in the middle of Jesus' ministry when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to a high mountain, and there he was transfigured before them. That means his appearance was changed like that of, almost like the brightness of the sun. And two others came to be with him. One was Moses. Who was the other? Elijah. So you see, Elijah is a great example of faith in how we need to be strong in our faith during those difficult times. I just want to make an observation. You remember that we sang Days of Elijah. You remember that chorus that we just sang this morning? Fresh in your minds? Fresh because it says, these are the days of Elijah declaring the word of the Lord. Do you know what, friends? I think we're in days of Elijah. I think we're in days of Elijah right now. We're in a battle that's similar to Elijah's on many fronts. At the time of Elijah, the nation of Israel was divided. There was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The split came after Solomon, and it was a time where they were just as divided as they ever have been. And when Elijah rebuilt the Lord's altar, what did he use to build that altar? Stones, okay? How many? Why 12? 12 tribes of Israel. You see, there's the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom and the 2 tribes in the southern kingdom. Elijah said, we're going to be done with that division stuff. Here's 12 stones. I'm going to make an altar out of these 12 stones to remind us that our unity comes when we're following the covenant that God has called us to honor. And he's basically saying to the people of Israel at that time, if we don't renew our covenant with God, we don't have a future as a nation. Could that be? Could that be something that would apply to us today in America? You see, Elijah, when he's building that altar, it says he says, come closer, come closer. He's simply saying to the people of Israel, I want you to notice what you're missing here. We don't have a nation unless it's under God. And if we refuse to put God first, we don't have a future. Friends, the flag is not going to be what unifies us as a nation. You see, culture says there are many ways for us to be connected with God. There are many ways for us to be put right with God. That's what culture says today. It's offensive to claim that there's just one pathway. It's so exclusive. And that, friends, disregards the clear truth claims that are contained in this book. That Jesus is the way, the only way. And until our nation is under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, we don't have a future. We're really good at keeping our options open. Isn't that what the people of Israel did? When Elijah first challenged them, what was their response to be true to the Lord, be faithful to His calling on your life? What did they do? Yes, that silence again. Great, you're working with me. Very good. That's us. We like to keep our options open, just in case. You see, today, we're reluctant to step up and say, this is who Jesus is. This is what He calls us to do. This is what He demands of us if we're going to be His followers. Friends, when I read my Bible, I read that Jesus wants full allegiance from His followers. He calls us to surrender our will, to His. He actually says, I want you to take up a cross if you're going to follow me. You know what, friends? Declaring the word of the Lord these days is not very popular. Can you relate? Declaring the word of the Lord is not very popular. We'd rather be told how great we are. Look at all that. We do such good work. And just we'll break our arm patting ourselves on the back. And God says, I'm ready to pour out some blessings on you, but I can't do it because you're not in covenant with me. And you know what? If we the people of God are not in covenant with the Lord, then how can He bless the nation? How can He be able to do what He wants to do in our nation unless we're going to commit ourselves to be under the lordship of Jesus and renew our covenant with Him? So, friends, this morning, I simply want to ask us, is Jesus truly our all in all? Is Jesus our greatest treasure? Is He number one in our lives? Because if He's not, then we're missing out on some blessings that God wants to give us. And Elijah's challenge is for us. Because Elijah challenges us to stand for truth even when nobody wants to hear it. So this morning, we're going to sing a closing song, and it's titled, "You Are My All in All." And I want you to think about the words of that song. I want you to really take to heart what it's saying, because if you sing it, it's a way of affirming our faith, a way of saying, this is what I've committed to. This is my affirmation of what I believe. And if you need to spend some time at the altar, this doesn't have 12 stones, but it'll do. If you need to spend some time at the altar, just recommitting yourself to the Lord and making Him your all in all, I invite you to do that as we're singing this song.